You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.metagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It's December 15th, 2022. It's 7:41 p.m. Pacific time. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was emotional regulation in relationship to mentalizing. So let's shift into that topic. We've been talking in the last few weeks about mentalizing, and we've been talking about it in terms of the early part of mentalizing that develops in the first 3 years of life directly in relationship to the caregivers, primary caregivers. It's in the early part of it, it's totally dyadic with whoever your primary caregiver is. You're presenting yourself authentically, needing some kind of care, don't even know what that is. Hopefully you have a caregiver who's sensitively attuned to you, who empathetically connects to you, who understands your language, mirrors that back to you and explains to you what it is so that you can begin to identify it, and then responds by taking care of you in the way that you need to be taken care of, so that you have the sense that you have an effect on the world. In Buddhism, what we mean by the world is other people. There's the self and there's other people. That's self and world. If you have a sense that you can express yourself completely authentically, that somebody bothers to understand what you're trying to communicate to them, and then responds in a way that's meaningful to you, you develop a sense of confidence, a sense of agency, a sense of capability, because you have the experience of your gestures, your authentic expressions, producing the care that you need so that you can survive and thrive in the world. And so that really is the cycle of developing secure attachment, that you express yourself, somebody sensitively enough attunes to you, they decode what you're expressing, they mirror it back to you, so you have as a way of validating the expression, and then they take care of you in a way that matches what your expression is, so that loop completes. In childhood experiences where that doesn't actually happen in that way, we begin to develop different mentalizing strategies. If your authentic expression is rejected by your caregivers and you have to do it in a way that makes sense to them, then you learn that. That would be what an avoidant child learns, that their authentic expression doesn't work. But if they express themselves in the way that the caregiver wants them to express it, they can reliably get what they want. It's not an authentic expression, it's not a genuine expression, but it does serve to get what the child wants. Where the child faces an unpredictable caregiver, where the caregiver sometimes shows up, sometimes doesn't show up, sometimes is absent, sometimes is harmful, then the child doesn't develop that sense of surety about what to do, and they just become expressive, one thing after another, without really monitoring too much, because it doesn't make any sense to monitor it, because there's no predictability in the way that the caregiver responds. So there's nothing to learn from the monitoring of it. And then if the caregiver is harming, and this frightens the child, and the child learns to hide from the experience of the caregiver. It's not all making sense. We don't, when we're born, have any real understanding of our emotions. We don't know the name of the emotions. We don't know how to regulate the emotions. And we learn this from the caregivers that we have in the way that they help us to regulate our emotional states when we're little. And then And when we move into the mid-childhood period, what the rules of the household are in terms of what expression is acceptable and what expression is not acceptable. And then when you go out into the adult world, you learn based on those earlier experiences how to use emotion in adult relationships so that you can succeed at getting the things that you want. The way that you learn what an emotion is in the early part is that you express yourself. Your caregiver sensitively attunes to you, empathetically connects to you, identifies the emotional experience that you're having, mimics the emotional experience that you're having on their face, and then naming it for you. And in this process, over and over again, we begin to associate these body sensations with that facial expression and that name, and then that experience that we're having, we know from the reflection of the caregiver that that's what the experience is. So there isn't a universal sadness. There's the sadness of your family group. There isn't a universal joy. There's a joy of your family group. That's what you learn. There are 220 words in the English language that describe discrete emotional states, and it's a lowish number for languages. Some languages have vastly more descriptions, but we don't learn the 220. We learn the vocabulary of our family system, so it depends how rich the emotional life of your family was or how restricted the emotional life was in your family system, so that you have a sense of what emotions are. And then also the strategies for regulating differ. Secure people tend to have access to the emotion. They tend to have it embodied, so they have the sensations in the body. They have the cognitive understanding of what that emotion is. And they also have regulation strategies that are pretty effective in regulating those experiences. Dismissing adults tend to not have an embodied sense of their emotion because the strategy that they learned for regulating emotion was to suppress conscious awareness of them. So they're not embodied. And depending on how far down the dismissing strategy you are, you may not even have a cognitive awareness of emotion. The problem with the suppression of emotion is that empathy is an empathetic. The empathetic experience of someone else is emotional, and if you suppress emotion, you also suppress a conscious awareness of the empathetic experience of someone else. So, in some sense, you're blind to their emotional experience. When we talk about empathy, we talk about the first level, which is this visceral response to witnessing someone else's physical or emotional pain. The second level is cognitively understanding that facial expressions and body language are reflective of certain internal emotional states. The third one is the embodied feeling of somebody else's emotion that you generate in your body. So empathetic emotion of the other person. In Buddhism, we would call it compassionate empathy. The fourth then is comparing what somebody says they're going to do with what they do, and comparing what they say they're not going to do with what they don't do, right? That's a full stack. In insecure experiences, that isn't actually what happens. And so when we talk about the mentalizing aspect, we want to begin to develop a clear availability of our emotional experience. So dismissing people may not have an embodied sense of emotion, but they may also not have a cognitive sense of emotion. When you think about the utility of the empathetic experience, Most of us will compare what somebody's the second level, somebody's facial expressions and body language, with the third level, the felt sense of them. And if they match, we will believe them. And if they don't match, we'll think that they're not telling us the truth. That's the mechanism that we have for that. Secure people also compare what people do to what they say they're going to do and what they feel like. But if you don't have access to emotions, then you can't do that. Most insecure attached people or disorganized attached people split off the what people say they're going to do with what they actually do piece, because they can't sum up the experience in the households they grow up with if they actually track what people say they're going to do and what they actually do, because it doesn't match up very well. And kids need to have a sense of a good, capable parent so that they're not anxious about what's going to happen to them. Is that making sense? So if you're dismissing and you don't have an embodied sense of emotion and you don't really recognize facial expressions or body language very well, then you rely on what people say to you about what their feeling states are. And if they stop telling you what their feeling states are, you don't know what's happening with them. That's one of the most fearful places for dismissing people, is when the person stops giving them the information that they need to operate in the relationship, because they can't detect it in another way. Preoccupied people get so focused on the other person that actually the empathetic experience of somebody else becomes their dominant emotional experience, and their own emotional experience becomes secondary. The problem with that is that they're not actually in physical proximity to the person. They lose the empathetic connection, and then they lose contact with what they experience as their emotional life. So it feels very depersonalizing. It can be terrifying or painful, surprisingly painful for a preoccupied person to be separated from the person that they focus on, because they're disconnected from what they experience as their emotional life, and are left with their own emotional experience, which is dysregulated typically because they don't regulate it. They're very good at regulating the empathetic experience so that the other person feels well regulated, but their own emotional life is not attended to well enough that they feel regulated. Disorganized people tend to socially isolate themselves out of fearfulness of being harmed in relationships. And so they're often in states of distress as a result of that, because we're herd animals. We're built biologically to be in complex social groups and to regulate our emotions in physical proximity to other people. There's just no way for us living in human bodies to operate completely isolated from other human beings. If you follow prisons at all, you'll understand that solitary confinement is considered the most severe punishment, and it's also in many places considered torturous because of the way that human beings are designed to be in proximity in the emotional experience of other people and to be regulated emotionally by other people. Is that making sense? So when we talk about expanding mentalizing into emotional regulation, what we want is to be able to have really good clarity about our own emotional states, really good clarity about the empathetic experience of other people, and then also to develop useful strategies for regulating our emotional states. If we look at the framework in which people learn to do this, we're all born autoregulators. And then if somebody comes well enough, we reorient to be externally regulated by our caregivers. And if the caregiver is reliable enough, we enter into a collaborative relationship with them where they teach us how to regulate our own emotions. We learn the lessons of emotional regulation. We develop the capacity to then provide that emotional regulation for ourselves, which then supports our ability to explore things that have meaning to us, but in a collaborative relationship. We attempt to develop as much capacity to regulate ourselves as we can. We want to be brilliant at it, really, so that we can go off and do our solo exploration. But at the same time, understand that it's easy to get sideswiped and not be able to bring yourself back into balance. And so you have to have a secure base, is what John Bowlby called it, of people who can help you re-regulate. And in secure relationships, you come and go from the regulating base to explore. And you don't worry so much about taking risks in your exploration because you know if you get completely discombobulated, you can come rushing back to the people that make up your secure base and that they'll catch you and that they're capable of bringing you back into emotional balance and then encouraging you to go back out and explore. That's that collaborative dynamic with the exploration piece in it. If that didn't happen for you when you were a kid, then what we need to do is begin to look at the deficits that you have so that you can begin skills training to build up those deficits. I think that one of the things that happens in meditation practice that isn't focused in this way is that we tend to gravitate toward meditating around the skill sets that we already have because it feels good and we feel accomplished in being able to do that. And we sort of avoid the deficit areas because it's painful and difficult and requires a lot of attention. And so we want to have that balance, focusing on the deficits so that we can really build up the skill set so that we can then move in the direction of secure functioning. If you look at, I like to talk about Dunbar numbers. Robin Dunbar is a researcher who studied the nature of human relationships and what an ideal constellation of human relationships would be, so that you have a way of tracking all of this and understanding how you're doing in this way, right? So he talks about AB relationships, which are above the line, which means you tell people that are above the line everything, which doesn't mean everything that happens to you, but when you're with them, you give an authentic expression that's complete about your experience of the present moment. C's and D's, E relationships, are below the line, so you're not obligated to be complete in your expression to them. You can express some things to them. One of the things about A and B relationships is that people who you afford that much trust have demonstrated to you that they're trustworthy. One of the things that insecure people do is they rush into relationships because they can't regulate the experience of abandonment terror. And so they overcommit too quickly before somebody really demonstrates that they're reliable. And then they're in a relationship where they've overcommitted to somebody who isn't reliable. It maps onto the early conditioning. Secure people don't tend to do that because they require reliability as the ground on which to build the relationship, whereas in the insecure and disorganized relationships, reliability is not really something that's been there. So it isn't a component that's required. If you're a dismissing adult and you don't have a sensory clarity of the embodied sense of emotion, and you don't have sensory clarity about facial expressions and body language, then you need to learn that. And that's learnable, like all of these things. If you're preoccupied, then you need to turn your attention back to your own emotional experience and reorder it so that that's the dominant emotional experience and that the empathetic experience becomes secondary where it's supposed to be. And if you're disorganized, it depends on the constellation of the disorganization, but you may have to develop sensory clarity of what your emotions are. You may have to reorient so that your primary emotional experience is your own, and you're going to need to learn emotional regulation skills that are capable of handling the swings that might be there. If you remember the constellation of how we seek care, the first thing an infant does to attract care is look as cute as they can. And that if that doesn't work, they look a little bit confused. And if that doesn't work, then they whimper. If that doesn't work, they intermittently cry. And if that doesn't work, they continuously cry. And if that doesn't work, they tantrum. And if that doesn't work, they fall off a cliff into anaclyptic depression, which is where they just shut down hard. Disorganized kids often have this last piece, which other people don't have. Right? If you have a childhood where you're neglected to the point that over and over again your nervous system just shut down to conserve energy, your brain develops in a way that other people's brains don't. So you need to then develop skills for coming out of anaclyptic depression, which other people would not have to do. So really is looking at what skills are in place and then how to begin to regulate them. We use a series of meditations called Investigating Self-Generated Emotion, Stopping Afflictive Self-Generated Emotion, Quantumizing the Pool of Poison and Pain, to look at the aspect of emotional regulation that most people will use. So adults primarily regulate through thinking. Dismissing people may regulate through physical activity, competitive activity, rather than thinking, because they don't really have a conscious experience of the emotion. But everybody else uses some form of thinking to do that. We learn in our family systems the thought processes that we use to regulate our emotions. And so we need to also have clarity of those. And so that's what we use the meditation for, to develop sensory clarity in the kind of thinking strategies that we use, and also to develop clarity of the emotional experiences that we have. So first is a basic training in discerning the domains of sensory clarity that we need. That one of the reasons that I like Shinzen's approach so much is that see, hear, feel, when you use the focus in, focus out strategy, really gives you a basis of clarity that you need. You don't need to go beyond that to be able to do the investigations that we would have follow that. So you would train in see, hear, feel, and then you would train in developing clarity and the focus in, focus out strategies. And then you would do the noting feeling states technique to develop an embodied sense of emotion, then move into the investigation of the different emotional regulation strategies that you use. One of the things about meditation is, and I think maybe our culture of impatience is that you need to have a result fast in order for it to seem worthwhile doing that. So that structure that I just described to you is months of practice in order to be able to do that. And so I don't tend to teach it in that way anymore. I tend to teach the investigation part first so that people can have a sense of what the reward would be for doing it. And then once you get past the beginning part of that, then go into developing the more industrial strength um, technique that's a Shinzen often calls his techniques industrial strength meditation, as opposed to a household cleaner, if you get the metaphor. One of the things about practice is it's not an on-off switch, really. Maybe a dimmer switch is a better thing. You start off, and the difference between a little practice and no practice at all is this huge leap, and then you have to put in the effort, and it's like a hockey puck in that sense. Is that you develop the skill, and that skill lets you go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper, and then all of a sudden, when the base skill is developed enough, it really begins to take off. And how you know that is that the way that you respond to the experience of your life changes. The self experience, ironically, doesn't change so much. But the way that what you do, that is to say, what the self observes you doing, is different, even though the experience of the self in coming up with what to do is the same. It's one of the paradoxes of the sense of self. Since the self experience is not the author or the generator of any of this, that's all unconscious. And the self is really just there to observe what you do. You see that you're doing things differently than you've ever done them before, but the experience of being the audience stays the same, if you can follow that. So in emotional regulation, noting feeling states technique is an amazing tool for really generating clarity in terms of your moment by moment emotional reaction. So you can begin to understand the intensity of the way that you respond to what's happening. We talk about this in four basic groups. First is the emotional reaction to the present moment, which plays out on the surface: face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms, inside of the legs. There's an emotional response. Really, what emotions are is the body mind getting ready to take an action in response to the conditions of the present moment. So if you're going to run away, the blood flows to the legs. There's a lot of adrenaline. There's some endorphins, so that you can run through the grass and get cut up without noticing it because you need to flee. If you need to fight, the blood all rushes into the upper body, into the arms, into the face. There's a lot of adrenaline, a lot of endorphins, so that you can stand and fight. If you feel joyful, it's an experience, really one of the only ones that's over the whole body. These patterns of experience. So what we do in that crucible of the dyadic relationship of the primary caregiver is we feel those sensations, and our caregiver attunes to us, connects to us empathetically, and then tells us what's happening and reflects it in their face so we can identify the facial expression that's tied to that body sensation, so that when as adults we're in conversation with somebody and we feel that sensation in our body and map it onto the facial expression of someone else, we can identify our empathetic experience of them. Is that making sense? There is a safety valve built into the system so that if the system gets overwhelmed, the emotional experience is dissociated and stored in the body. We call it somaticized emotional experience. And then that has the capacity to release if you pay attention to it. So present moment experience, self-generated emotion by thinking, somaticized emotional experience, and the empathetic experience of other people are the four that we work with. If you can't tell them apart, they can just clump together and produce a very intense emotional experience, which you don't really can't really make sense out of. So we want to know what the emotional experience, the direct reaction to the present moment is. We want to be able to track our thought processes in response to that, and the emotional component of that thought process. If we have somaticized emotion and it reacts to the present moment and releases emotional intensity, we want to be able to separate that from the other two, and then also have a clear picture of the empathetic experience of other people. If you can do all of that, then I would say that you have good clarity around your emotional experience. And if you can't do all of that, then you need to practice in a way that that sensory clarity develops, and then the capacity for equanimity with those experiences develops. If you don't have that, for instance, let's say there's a reaction of level 2 sadness to the present moment, and that generates a thought process that adds another 3 points of sadness. And that resonates with the pool of sadness, which releases another 3. And then you react to the present moment as if the present moment contained 8 points of sadness, when actually the present moment is actually only 2 points. And then people say, you're overreacting to this. And you're thinking, I'm not overreacting to this. This is what I'm feeling. But because you don't have clarity to understand the components of the feeling, you don't know that, oh, yeah, the present moment is only 2 points. And then if somebody tries to help you and they relieve the 2 points of sadness, they don't relieve the self-generated sadness. They don't relieve the somaticized experience of sadness. And so you can feel that they're not doing enough. They're not taking care of you well enough because they're not relieving the distress that you experience, even though they've done everything that they can to relieve the distress, and they have relieved the distress that's associated with the present moment. That all making sense? The other thing that you get out of really being able to develop a great capacity for emotional regulation is you can use it to explore. You can really go out to the edge and regulate the experience of that without having to limit the risk taking to limit the emotional distress. And then you can also hold emotional space for the people close to you so that they can explore to the edge of what they need to know to find meaning, knowing that even if they're completely demolished when they come rushing back to you, you have the space to emotionally regulate them. If you don't have the space and they keep coming back and they're more dysregulated than you have the capacity to regulate them, we all tend to subtly try to talk them into limiting their exploration so that they don't exceed our capacity to emotionally experience that. And so then we're actually interfering with their capacity to explore rather than supporting it and encouraging it. And they may do the same for us because we come back in such a mess that they can't bring us back into balance. If you limit your exploration, of course, you limit the meaning that you find. And at a certain point, you can be in despair about the difficulty of life because you don't have enough meaning. Whereas if you had enough meaning, the difficulties of life wouldn't seem like such a big obstacle. So I thought that we would do a little bit of noting feeling states technique tonight, so that you can begin to have a sense of where you're at in terms of emotional regulation. Noting feeling states technique is where you track the moment by moment emotional experience in the body. So an embodied sense of emotion. Face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms, inside of the legs. It's a vibratory energy. The first thing we do is discern whether it's emotional or not. And then the second thing we do is to try and define which emotional experience it is, understanding that it's perfectly ordinary to have emotional experiences which aren't clearly defined. But if you can recognize the emotional experience, and you have a name for it, you can label it by the name. So anger, fear, sadness, excitement, I call that the basic four, right? Anger, fear, sadness, excitement. Paul Eckhart has a website, not an app, called Atlas of Emotions, which has all of the emotional experiences that we have words for, organized around 7 primary emotions: anger, fear, sadness, disgust, contempt, surprise, and happiness. Those are the 7 that he thinks are universal. So we're not trying to really develop the nuance of these. Just broad categories: anger, fear, sadness, good enough. We want to also come into equanimity with the experience of emotion so that we can tolerate the intensity of it. And we also want to get good enough at it that we can take this out as a practice in life and use it as one of our meditation-based emotional regulation strategies. The good thing about meditation-based strategies is they're not cognitive, so they don't collapse under stress. So they have a real utility to them. Any thought-based emotional regulation strategies that you have don't survive even a moderate level of stress, because your cognitive mind or your cognitive capacity to think diminishes so quickly. So the procedural based, like meditation based techniques are much better. If you don't know the name of the emotion, then that's perfectly ordinary, and that's just, we can label that something or don't know. It's perfectly ordinary that there's no emotion in the body at a given moment. So we either label it the emotion with the name that we know it to be, we label it as something or don't know if there's emotional activity, but there's no clarity. If there's no emotion in the body, we label that as rest or none. Is that making sense? And then we'll do a few minutes of a concentration practice just to settle the mind, brighten it up if we need to. So how did that go?
Feeling tone was pretty quiet, a lot of neutrality.
Good. Not much going on. It's a good thing. All right. We are going to meet next week, but not the week after. And then the week after that, in the new year, we'll start again. We have a level 1 starting in January. We have a level 2 starting in February. We're doing another level 1 in March. We're doing a EU level 1 in April. We're going to start another level 2, I think, in May. And then in September, we're going to start the first EU level 2. I'm teaching a retreat in Utrecht in June. I want to come to Europe for a short retreat. So that's the first half of next year, what we're planning. If you're interested in any of that, it's on the website. Take a look. I offer this teaching freely, but I do hope that you'll make a donation. There's a link on the website to do it. Any amount is helpful. It supports me and also the work that we're doing. Really appreciate your practice. Thank you. And we'll see you somewhere on the path, I hope, soon. Bye.